My name is Lauren Miller. I am 30 years old, and for most of my life I tried to win a place in my family by giving more than I had. I believed if I worked harder, stayed longer, sacrificed enough, they would finally see me. On the morning of my sister's wedding, I thought it was my chance. I had planned every detail, spent nights awake making sure nothing went wrong. But instead of gratitude, my parents looked me in the eye and told me to stay invisible, to not ruin her moment. In that instant, I felt something break and something else ignite. What would you do if your own family decided you were better unseen? Stay with me, because what I chose to do next changed everything. Let me take you back to where it began. The morning of my sister's wedding in Brookfield started with the kind of busy chaos everyone else seemed to enjoy, but that made my stomach twist. The house was full of relatives' voices, carrying from the kitchen laughter, spilling into the hallway the sound of heels clicking on hardwood floors. I held a small velvet box in my hands, the necklace I had saved $2,500 to buy, a delicate silver chain with a sapphire pendant. I thought it might finally make Rachel smile at me, even if just for a moment. I had been running back and forth for days, carrying decorations, confirming flower deliveries, checking that the catering company had the right menu. My hands were dry from folding place cards until midnight, my back sore from hauling boxes of candles and linens into the church hall. That morning I came into the living room, carrying one last container of programs. Eleanor, my mother, stood in front of the fireplace, adjusting the pearl earrings she always wore when she wanted to look important. She glanced up at me with that sharp, assessing look I knew too well. Thomas, my father, sat nearby with a cup of coffee, quietly watching like he always did when she spoke. Eleanor's eyes met mine. Her voice was calm but cut through the air like glass. "Stay invisible today, Lauren. Do not ruin this for your sister." The words hit harder than if she had shouted. My chest tightened, and I waited for her to laugh, to say she was kidding. She didn't. I looked at my father, searching for any trace of hesitation. His jaw tightened, and he gave a small nod, as if the verdict had been handed down, and there was nothing left to argue. Rachel came down the stairs just then, wearing a silk robe, her hair half curled and pinned back. She glanced at me but quickly looked away, focusing on her phone in her hand. I opened my mouth, wanting to say something, anything, to break the weight of what my mother had just told me. My throat closed instead. Thomas finally spoke. "It is her day, Lauren. The last thing she needs is you making people look at the wrong thing." I felt heat rise in my face, my hands gripping the box of programs tighter. The house buzzed around me with voices and music, but it was as if everything muted for a moment. I looked down at the necklace in my bag and realized how foolish I had been to think it would change anything. Eleanor turned back to arranging flowers on the mantel, her tone final. "Just do as I asked. Stay invisible." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I thought of the months I had spent preparing, the late nights, sending emails, the money I had given up that could have gone toward my own life. None of it mattered. All they wanted from me was silence. Aunt June walked past, carrying a tray of champagne flutes, glancing at me with an awkward smile, the kind people give when they overhear something uncomfortable but pretend not to. My cousin Marcy whispered to her husband and looked quickly away. The humiliation pressed down on me harder than my mother's words. I stood there another minute, the box heavy in my arms, my heart pounding in my ears. I wanted Rachel to say something, even one word, to soften the blow. She smoothed her robe, tapped her phone, and walked back toward the kitchen without a word. The room spun a little, and I set the programs on the coffee table. My voice, when it finally came, was almost steady. "Fine." I walked down the hall to the coat closet, where my bag sat tucked behind a pile of jackets. My hands moved without thought, shoving the necklace box and my keys into the bag. The smell of my mother's perfume drifted through the air as I zipped it shut. I could still hear laughter and clinking glasses from the dining room, as if the house had already forgotten I was there. I opened the front door. The cool morning air rushed over me, carrying the scent of cut grass and the faint sound of church bells in the distance. For a moment, I stood on the porch, gripping the strap of my bag, wondering if I should wait, if I should go back and apologize even though I had done nothing wrong. Instead, I walked down the steps, the gravel crunching beneath my shoes. My car sat at the curb, dew still on the windshield. I slid inside, started the engine, and let the hum of it drown out the last echoes of my mother's voice. The rearview mirror reflected the white siding of the house I had grown up in, the porch, crowded with people moving in and out, none of them noticing me drive away. The road out of Brookfield stretched ahead, quiet and empty. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles whitened, my chest still burning from the words I could not shake. Stay invisible. I drove without a destination, only the certainty that I would not return to that house, not that day, maybe not ever. The sun rose higher, painting the fields with light, while behind me my family gathered to celebrate the daughter who had always been the star. I kept driving, the town fading in my rear view, the necklace box pressing against my side in the bag, a reminder of everything I had given and how little it mattered. For the first time in years, I let the silence of the road surround me. It felt both terrifying and strangely freeing, as if a door had just closed for good, and I was finally standing on the other side. The miles slipped under my tires as I left Brookfield behind, the farmland stretching out in quiet rows of corn and soybeans. I did not turn on the radio. I did not call anyone. The only sound was the steady hum of the engine and the occasional rattle of loose change in the cup holder. My hands stayed tight on the wheel, my breath shallow, as if any moment someone might call and order me back. No one did. My phone sat silent on the passenger seat, the screen dark. I drove past the gas station where I used to stop for coffee before work, past the old movie theater on Main Street, with its chipped marquee letters, past the church where the reception would be held that night. I could almost hear the organ warming up, the sound of shoes scuffing against polished wood, the clink of champagne glasses. The thought of them celebrating without me left a dull ache in my chest, but there was also relief. I was not there to be told to hide, to be told to keep quiet. The highway opened in front of me, gray and endless. I pulled into a rest stop outside Dayton when my stomach growled. The diner smelled of fried bacon and strong coffee, the kind of place truckers filled at all hours. I slid into a booth, ordered eggs and toast, and stared out the window at my car, wondering what exactly I was doing. The waitress, a woman with tired eyes and a smile that looked practiced, poured me coffee. She asked if I was traveling far. I told her I was just passing through. She nodded as if she had heard that story before. I ate slowly, my fork heavy in my hand, my mind circling the same thought. I had left. I had walked out without a plan, without telling anyone where I was going. It felt reckless, but it also felt like the only choice. By the time I finished breakfast, the knot in my stomach had loosened just enough. I paid in cash, slid back into my car, and pulled onto the road again. The sky was pale blue, the sun climbing, but inside I felt suspended, like time had paused. I did not drive to work, though it was Monday, and I had emails waiting. I turned toward my apartment on the edge of Brookfield instead. The small one-bedroom had always been my retreat, though never truly mine, since my parents felt free to drop by whenever they pleased. I parked outside, carried my bag upstairs, and locked the door behind me. The silence pressed heavy against my ears. I dropped onto the couch, my hands trembling. The necklace box slipped from my bag and landed on the coffee table with a soft thud. I stared at it, imagining Rachel's smile as she opened her other gifts, surrounded by applause and flashing cameras, while mine sat untouched here. My eyes burned, but I did not cry. Something inside had dried up, leaving only resolve. I pulled my laptop from the shelf and opened it. My reflection glowed faintly on the screen. For a long time, I did not type. Then I opened a blank document and began listing everything I needed to sever. Bank accounts, apartment lease, job, phone plan. Every tie that kept me tethered to the life that had told me to disappear. The first step was the money. Years ago, my parents had convinced me to set up a joint account, claiming it was for family expenses, especially for my mother's medications and household bills. I had poured most of my savings into it, always told it was the right thing to do. Now I saw it for what it was, another leash. I picked up my phone and scrolled to Mark Henderson's number. He was a lawyer I had met months earlier at a networking event in Columbus, sharp and kind in a quiet way. I hesitated before pressing call. When he answered, his voice was calm. "Lauren, what can I do for you?" I told him everything in a rush. The wedding, the words my parents had thrown at me, the years of giving without recognition. My voice wavered but steadied as I spoke about the joint accounts. "I want out," I said. "I want to make sure they cannot drain what I put in." He paused, then said, "We can freeze the accounts temporarily while we sort the details. You have every right to protect your contributions." His assurance lifted something heavy from my shoulders. He asked if I could come to his office the next morning in Columbus. I agreed without thinking, relief washing through me. After hanging up, I leaned back, the room spinning slightly. It was real now. I had taken the first step, not just to leave emotionally, but to leave legally. The rest of the day blurred. I packed a small suitcase with clothes, tucked my journal and laptop inside, and set it by the door. I tossed old magazines into the trash, cleared the dishes from the sink. Every action felt final, like erasing myself from a place that had never truly been home. As dusk settled the sky outside, my windows streaked orange and pink, I sat on the floor with a cup of tea and watched the street below. Families walked dogs, kids rode bikes, neighbors waved. Their lives moved in steady rhythm while mine felt cracked open. My phone buzzed once on the table. A text from an unknown number, though I knew the voice behind it. "Where are you?" That was all it said. My chest tightened. I deleted it without replying. Night crept in shadows, stretching across the walls. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. Every sound amplified: the hum of the refrigerator, the faint buzz of a streetlight outside. I tried to picture Rachel in her gown, the crowd cheering, my parents smiling wide. I imagined them lifting their glasses as if nothing had been lost. Maybe in their minds nothing had. Sleep came in broken fragments. When I woke at dawn the next morning, the decision still felt right. I showered, dressed, and grabbed the suitcase. The necklace box remained on the coffee table. I left it there, a silent marker of everything I had given and everything I was done giving. The drive to Columbus took an hour. The city stirred awake around me, commuters rushing, horns echoing through streets lined with glass towers and old brick storefronts. I parked near Mark's office, the suitcase heavy in my hand as I climbed the stairs. He greeted me with a steady handshake and ushered me into a conference room that smelled faintly of leather and coffee. He spread papers across the table, his tone firm but reassuring. "We will file today. The accounts will be frozen by evening. They cannot touch what is yours." As I signed the documents, my hand steadied. My parents were likely raising glasses at brunch, telling guests how flawless the day had been. They had no idea their control was already slipping. Mark looked at me, his brow furrowed slightly. "You understand, this is a big step. Once we begin, it sets a boundary that will be hard to undo." I nodded, my voice quiet but certain. "That is exactly what I need." I left the office with the city buzzing around me, the papers tucked in my bag, the weight of years of silence finally starting to lift. The morning sun glinted off the windows of tall buildings, and for the first time in a long while, I felt as though I was walking toward something instead of running from it. I carried the papers back to my car and sat for a long time with the door open, the cool air brushing against my face. The relief was there, but beneath it came a tide of memories that refused to stay quiet. Every signature I had put on those forms seemed to unlock a piece of the past moments when I had tried so hard to be seen and had been told instead to shrink. I thought about being 8 years old, standing in the kitchen with a drawing I had worked on for days. It was a watercolor of our house with the maple tree in the front yard. I held it out to my mother, excited, expecting her to tape it to the fridge like she had done with Rachel's report cards. She glanced at it and gave me a quick smile before saying, "Rachel just won first place in the math tournament. That is real talent." She set my picture down on the counter, and it slid toward a stack of unopened mail. I stood there pretending it did not sting, but I went back to my room and cried into my pillow until my throat hurt. Later that same year, Rachel brought home a soccer trophy. My parents cleared space on the living room shelf and placed it under the best light. I asked if my ribbon from the county fair art contest could go next to it. My father patted my shoulder and said, "Not everything needs to be on display. Kiddo, family harmony matters." I learned to tuck things away, to stop asking. By middle school, the pattern was clear. If Rachel wanted the last slice of pizza, she got it. If we argued over the swing in the backyard, my mother told me to stop being selfish. Rachel needed space to grow, I was told, while my job was to keep the peace. At night I would lie awake listening to the faint hum of the dishwasher and wonder if maybe I had been born wrong, if maybe I had missed whatever quality made parents proud. High school only sharpened the divide. Rachel was in honors classes captain of the debate team, homecoming queen. I worked hard too, practicing piano for hours, joining clubs, pushing myself in art and writing. But every dinner conversation circled back to her achievements. My mother beamed while recounting Rachel's leadership award. My father bragged about her acceptance to Northwestern. When I mentioned winning an essay contest, my mother smiled politely, then asked Rachel about her upcoming scholarship interview. The words I had prepared shrank inside me unspoken. The comparisons did not stop at school. When I brought a boy home junior year, my mother cornered me in the kitchen afterward and said he seemed nice but lacked ambition, not like Rachel's boyfriend who was already looking at law schools. That boyfriend broke up with Rachel 2 months later, but no one remembered my mother's comments about him. They only remembered that my date was not good enough. One Christmas, I tried to give a speech at the family table, a simple thank you for their support, though I barely had any examples to offer. Halfway through, my father cut me off, asking Rachel to tell the story of her internship in Chicago. Everyone clapped and my words dissolved into the clatter of silverware. I excused myself and washed dishes alone, my throat aching with the words I had swallowed. I carried these moments like small stones in my pockets, heavy but invisible to anyone else. Even as I grew older and tried to step into my own life, the old lessons clung to me. Keep quiet, do not compete, be invisible. Driving through Columbus that morning, I realized how deeply those lessons had settled. The apartment I rented, the job I chose, even the men I dated, all shaped by the fear of being too much or asking for too much. I had convinced myself that if I stayed available, stayed useful, maybe one day I would be allowed to matter. I parked near the riverfront and walked along the path, the papers still folded in my bag. Children laughed as they chased pigeons, joggers passed with earbuds, and an older couple held hands on a bench. Watching them, I felt the ache of everything I had missed by shrinking to fit a role that was never mine. I remembered the summer before Rachel left for college. I was 19, working part-time at a local bookstore, saving money for community college classes. My parents organized a farewell dinner for her, inviting neighbors and friends. They decorated the backyard with lights, filled the tables with food, gave speeches about her bright future. When someone asked what I planned to study, my mother answered for me. She said, "Lauren is staying local, helping us at the office when we need it." Everyone nodded and turned back to Rachel. No one asked me another question. That night, after the guests left, I sat on the back steps, staring at the empty plates and glasses, the glow of the lights dimming. Rachel came out, her suitcase already packed. She hugged me quickly and said, "Take care of them for me." I nodded, and from that moment on it seemed decided. My life would orbit theirs while hers shot into the sky. I carried the weight of that goodbye for years. I took classes when I could afford them, never full-time. I answered calls from my mother during lunch breaks, drove her to appointments, filled in at their office when a secretary was out sick. My father called it loyalty. I called it duty. Deep down, I hoped it might someday be seen as love. Now, standing on the path by the river, I felt something shift. Those memories had once chained me, but signing those papers had cracked the lock. I realized my parents' words at the wedding were not new. They were the same message I had been given all along, only spoken louder. Stay invisible. The breeze off the water carried the faint sound of church bells from downtown. I closed my eyes and let the sound wash over me. For the first time, I thought maybe invisibility did not have to be a sentence. Maybe it could be a choice. I could choose to step away, to no longer fight for a place at a table that was never set for me. I turned back toward my car, the city alive around me. My phone buzzed again in my pocket. I did not look at it. I slid into the driver's seat, started the engine, and gripped the wheel. The road ahead felt open, unmarked, waiting for me to decide where it would lead. I drove back to my apartment in Brookfield and sat on the couch with the suitcase still packed by the door. The papers from Mark's office were safe in my bag, but the weight of years spent bending to my family's needs pressed against me harder than the suitcase handle ever had. I let myself remember the moments I had kept buried, the times when I put them first, and watched my own chances slip away. When I was 20, I got my first real job at a small marketing agency in Columbus. It was not glamorous, but it was steady work, and I loved the rush of creating campaigns that people noticed. I remember the thrill when my supervisor told me she wanted me to apply for a junior manager position. The interviews were scheduled for a week in March. 2 days before my mother called me at my desk. Her voice was shaky. She said she had dizzy spells and could not drive herself to the doctor. She told me I was the only one she could count on. Rachel was away at school. My father was busy with tax season at the office, and she needed me. I drove her across town that afternoon, missing an important meeting at work. The doctor said it was stress and dehydration, nothing urgent, but by then I had already postponed my interview. My boss told me she understood, but the position went to someone else. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with the rejection letter on the screen and tried to swallow the bitter taste that rose in my throat. It happened again and again. Every time I thought I might move forward, something pulled me back. My father called during lunch breaks, asking if I could cover phones at the office. My mother needed help with paperwork or errands. They never asked Rachel, who was too busy chasing promotions in Chicago. It was always me. I convinced myself it was loyalty. I told myself family came first, that my sacrifices meant something. But the truth was, they had trained me to believe my life was less important than theirs. Claire Johnson was the only one who ever said it out loud. She sat across from me in the break room one afternoon, her brown hair pulled back, her coffee steaming in her hands. She asked why I kept missing chances to take on bigger projects. I told her my family needed me. She shook her head and said, "Lauren, your family will take as much as you give. They will never stop. If you keep saying yes, you will stay in the same spot forever." Her words stung because they were true. I laughed it off, pretending I did not care, but later that night I wrote them in my journal. By the time I turned 25, Rachel was already working as a financial analyst in Chicago. My parents threw a dinner party when she bought her first condo, inviting neighbors and clients from their accounting office. They toasted her success while I passed hors d'oeuvres around the table. When someone asked what I was doing, my mother answered before I could speak. She said I was helping at the office and keeping things running at home. Everyone nodded approvingly, and I sank into my chair with my plate of food untouched. The pattern never changed. I dated men who lost interest once they saw how entangled I was with my parents' demands. One boyfriend ended things after my mother grilled him at dinner, asking if he was as ambitious as Rachel's partner. He never called again. I told myself he was not right for me, but deep down I knew he had seen the truth. My life was not my own. All of that history swirled in my mind as I sat in my apartment after the wedding day. I looked at the walls painted beige, the couch. I had saved months to buy the bookshelf lined with marketing books and art supplies I barely touched anymore. The space felt less like a home and more like a waiting room, a place I had settled because it was close to my parents, close enough to run when they called. I picked up my journal and flipped through the pages. The entries told the same story again and again. Cancelled trips, missed chances, apologies written to myself in the margins. At the bottom of one page from 2 years earlier, I had scrawled a question. When will it be enough? I closed the book and set it on the table. My phone buzzed, lighting up with Claire's name. I answered hesitantly. She asked if I had survived the wedding chaos. I told her what had happened, my voice flat, the words spilling before I could stop them. She was quiet for a moment, then said softly, I am sorry, Lauren. I wish I could say I am surprised. I told her I had gone to see Mark, that the accounts were frozen. She let out a low whistle. That is big. Are you ready for what comes next? I said I did not know, but I could not go back. I was done waiting for approval that would never come. She told me she was proud of me, that she hoped I would finally see what she had seen all along, that I was capable of more than being the family's shadow. Her words lingered long after we hung up, circling in my mind as I paced the apartment. The clock ticked past midnight, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. I stood at the window watching the streetlights flicker against the pavement. Cars passed, their headlights glowing, each one heading somewhere chosen. For the first time, I wondered what it would feel like to choose a destination for myself. I pulled the suitcase closer to the door and unzipped it. My clothes were still neatly folded inside, waiting. I placed the journal on top and closed it again. The apartment suddenly felt smaller, like the walls were pressing in. I lay down on the couch instead of the bed, staring at the ceiling until my eyes blurred. Sleep came in waves, restless and thin, broken by the sound of my phone buzzing on the table. I did not reach for it. Morning light crept through the blinds, soft and gray. I sat up slowly, the taste of bitterness still on my tongue, but mixed now with something sharper. Determination. I brewed coffee, poured it into a travel mug, and sat with it in my hands. The silence of the apartment was thick, but it no longer felt like a refuge. It felt like a place I had already outgrown. I set the mug down and looked at the packed suitcase. It waited by the door like a quiet reminder that I had choices. For years my path had been drawn for me, but now the map was blank. I took a deep breath, picked up the suitcase, and walked to the door, knowing the next step would decide everything. I stepped outside with the suitcase in one hand and the travel mug in the other. The morning air was cool, the kind that hinted at rain later in the day, and the street was quiet except for a jogger passing by with her dog. I loaded the suitcase into the trunk of my car and slid into the driver's seat. For a moment I sat there with the engine off, staring at the steering wheel, waiting for the guilt to creep back in. It did not. Instead, a strange calm settled over me, the kind that comes when there is nothing left to lose. I drove toward the church hall where the wedding reception would be held that evening. The decorations I had ordered were already being delivered, the florist and the caterer arriving in vans, unloading crates of flowers and trays of food. I parked across the street and watched from inside my car. A group of bridesmaids carried boxes inside, laughing, their dresses covered in plastic. My mother was at the entrance, directing people with sharp gestures, her pearls glinting in the sunlight. My father stood nearby, checking his watch. They both looked so satisfied, as if everything was unfolding exactly as they had planned. I sat there for almost half an hour, sipping lukewarm coffee, watching them move in and out. Not one glance in my direction. Not one pause that suggested they wondered where I was. I realized then that I could vanish completely, and they would still smile for the cameras, proud that nothing had spoiled Rachel's big day. I started the car and drove away. At the next red light, I reached for my phone. There were no missed calls from Rachel, no texts from either of my parents. Only a message from Claire asking if I was all right. I typed a quick reply telling her I was safe, then put the phone back down. Back at my apartment, I pulled out the thick binder I had built for the wedding, every receipt and contract neatly tucked into plastic sleeves. I laid it on the kitchen table and flipped through the pages. Hours of work stared back at me, each one marked with my handwriting, each one ignored by the people it was meant to impress. I closed the binder with a snap and shoved it into a drawer. I turned to the small velvet box sitting on the counter. The necklace inside sparkled when I opened it, the sapphire catching the light. I had imagined Rachel wearing it, imagined her looking at me with gratitude, maybe even love. Now it sat there as proof of how far I was willing to go for recognition I would never receive. I snapped it shut and tucked it deep into my suitcase. The hours of that day stretched out slowly. My parents called twice, their numbers flashing on the screen, but I let the phone buzz until it stopped. I knew exactly what they wanted for me to show up, smile, politely fade into the background. I was not going to give them that gift. By late afternoon, I changed into jeans and a sweater and walked to a small diner 2 blocks away. The place smelled of grilled onions and coffee, the booths cracked from years of use. I slid into a seat and ordered a cheeseburger. The waitress, a young woman with freckles, asked if I was headed to a wedding. I told her no, not anymore. She raised an eyebrow but did not pry. As I ate, I imagined the scene unfolding at the hall. Rachel stepping out in her white gown, guests clapping, cameras flashing, my mother beaming as if she had orchestrated the whole thing, which in many ways she had, my father raising a glass to toast the couple, and me absent just as they had wanted. The thought should have crushed me. Instead, it felt like release. They had demanded I stay invisible, and I had given them exactly that, but on my own terms. When I returned to my apartment, the sky had darkened. I drew the curtains and sat on the couch with my journal open on my lap. The pen moved quickly across the page, words spilling out faster than I could think. I wrote about the years of carrying their expectations, about the countless nights I stayed up arranging details that were dismissed, about the sharp sting of my mother's voice that morning. I wrote until my hand cramped and the pages blurred. I finally set the journal down and leaned back, listening to the muffled music drifting in from downtown, where the reception was surely in full swing. Laughter carried faintly through the open window, mingling with the sound of traffic. Somewhere, just a few miles away, my family celebrated the perfect picture without me. I stood and walked to the window, watching the headlights glide past. A car slowed at the corner, its horn honking as friends shouted through open windows on their way to the party. I closed the blinds and let the darkness settle. In that silence, a thought came to me, sharp and undeniable. If they wanted me invisible, then I would disappear completely. Not just from the wedding, not just for one night, but from their lives. The decision felt heavy and light all at once. I paced the apartment, running through the steps in my mind. I had savings in my account, enough to last if I was careful. The lease could be broken with a penalty. My job would accept a resignation, even if short notice hurt them. None of it mattered as much as cutting the ties that had bound me for too long. I sat at the table again, pulled out my laptop, and opened a list I had started before. Sell the apartment furniture, close the lease, resign from the agency, forward my mail to a new address. Every bullet point was a doorway out. The night stretched on as I refined the plan. I checked real estate listings in nearby towns, looked at small coastal places in South Carolina where the rent was low and no one knew my name. My search history filled with moving services, mailbox rentals, freelance job boards. Around midnight, I closed the laptop and stood at the window again. The street was empty now, the noise from the reception faded. I pressed my palm against the cool glass and whispered words I had never dared to say out loud. I am done. The suitcase stood ready by the door, the journal tucked inside the necklace box, hidden beneath clothes. I turned off the lights and lay on the couch once more. This time, when sleep came, it carried no dreams of being noticed, no aching wish for their approval. It was deep, steady, and strangely peaceful, as if I had already begun to step into another life. The sound of my phone buzzing woke me before dawn, sharp and insistent on the nightstand. I blinked at the screen, the glow cutting through the darkness. My mother's name filled the display, followed by my father's number just minutes later. I let both calls ring out until they stopped. A text appeared almost immediately after, short and cold. "Where are you?" I lay back against the pillow, staring at the ceiling, my chest tightening. For years I would have jumped at those words, apologizing, rushing to explain. Now I rolled to my side, turned the phone face down, and let the silence return. By mid-morning I walked to the window, pulling the blinds aside. Across the street, a delivery truck unloaded, flowers, the bright colors spilling onto the sidewalk. For a second I thought of the church hall, how those same flowers now filled the tables where my family laughed with guests. The image stung, but it was dulled by distance. Around noon, I gathered my courage and drove toward the hall. I told myself I only wanted to see it from afar, to make peace with what I had left behind. The parking lot was full, cars lined down the block. Music floated faintly from inside, the kind of upbeat rhythm that carried joy whether you wanted it or not. I parked half a street away, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. Through the open doors I could see Rachel twirling in her gown, the lights glinting off sequins. My mother hovered at her side, fussing over the veil, while my father clapped Daniel on the back. Guests filled the room, their voices rising in a chorus of cheer. No one looked to the street, no one noticed me watching. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, waiting for some pang of regret to force me out of the car. Instead, the words repeated in my head, the same ones that had been spoken to me like a verdict. Stay invisible. A voice pulled me from my thoughts. A woman stood on the sidewalk near my car, balancing a bouquet wrapped in clear plastic. Susan Coleman, the church photographer, recognized me instantly. Her eyes flickered with something between pity and hesitation. She tapped the window lightly. I rolled it down halfway, my pulse quickening. She shifted the flowers in her arms. You should be inside. I shook my head. Not today. Her lips pressed together, a look of discomfort settling on her face. I heard what your mom said, she murmured. I am sorry. She glanced toward the hall as if afraid of being seen talking to me. I forced a smile that felt thin. It is fine. Enjoy the party. She nodded quickly and walked away, leaving me alone again. That brief exchange confirmed what I already knew. People had seen, people had heard, and yet no one had spoken up. They had all chosen silence. I started the engine and drove home, the image of Rachel glowing under the lights etched behind my eyes. As I pulled into my driveway, my phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from my father. Do not embarrass us. Stay away. I read it twice, the words blurring as anger surged in my chest. It was not a request. It was an order. And they still believed I would obey. Inside the apartment, I dropped my keys on the counter and sat heavily on the couch. The velvet box caught my eye, still tucked in the suitcase. I pulled it out and snapped it open. The sapphire sparkled under the lamp. A gift meant to bridge a gap that had never closed. I closed the lid and pushed it aside, the gesture final. As evening settled, the sound of celebration carried faintly through the town. I turned on the television to drown it out, but every laugh track, every burst of applause reminded me of the party. I switched it off and sat in the quiet. Then, almost without thinking, I opened my laptop. My fingers hovered over the keys before I began searching moving companies, rental listings, mailbox services. I looked at coastal towns where no one knew the Miller name, where no one expected me to be the shadow of someone else. The more I searched, the lighter I felt, as though I was already slipping out of their grasp. When the fireworks started across town, signaling the end of the reception, I stepped onto the balcony. The bursts lit up the sky, glittering reds and golds reflecting against the windows. I imagined Rachel's face lifted in awe, my parents smiling, guests cheering. The perfect picture. I whispered into the night, so soft only I could hear. You wanted me invisible. Now you will have it. I closed the balcony door, drew the curtains, and let the apartment fall into darkness. The plan forming in my mind was no longer a fragile idea. It was a promise to myself. Sleep came in fragments again, restless but steady enough. When morning arrived, I woke to silence. The phone was filled with unanswered calls and sharp messages, but I scrolled past them without pause. My hand settled on the suitcase by the door. It was still packed, still waiting, and so was I. I lifted the suitcase and carried it to the car, each step steadier than the one before. The streets of Brookfield were quiet that Sunday morning, the town still shaking off the haze of last night's celebration. Balloons clung to mailboxes, wilted flowers lay scattered near the curb, reminders of the wedding that had gone on without me. I drove past the church, the parking lot already half empty, and did not slow down. The highway stretched open, and for the first time I did not feel the pull to turn back. I headed toward Columbus, the city skyline sharp against the pale sky. My first stop was Mark Henderson's office. He was already waiting with a folder of documents spread neatly across the conference table. He gestured for me to sit. The freeze is in place, Lauren. By tonight they will not be able to touch those accounts. I let out a breath I had not realized I was holding. So it is really done. He nodded. The bank confirmed. If your parents or sister try to withdraw without proper proof, the system will block it. The words carried a weight that settled into my bones. For years, I had watched my savings siphoned away into family expenses. Now there was a wall, and it was mine. Mark leaned forward, his voice steady. This will not make them happy. You need to be ready for their reaction. I looked down at my hands resting on the table. I am ready. We spent another hour going over logistics, what paperwork to keep, how to direct legitimate payments for my mother's prescriptions and household bills. Mark was precise, careful, making sure everything was documented. When it was finished, he closed the folder and offered a small smile. You just took back control. Do not let them convince you otherwise. Leaving the office, I felt lighter, as if some invisible chain had been cut. The city buzzed with life, but inside I carried a quiet stillness. Back at my apartment, I began the process of dismantling the life I had lived there. I photographed furniture for online listings, posted my couch and dining set, sorted clothes into donation bags. The act of letting go was strangely satisfying. Each item that left the apartment felt like another weight lifted from my shoulders. In the middle of taping up boxes, my phone buzzed again. A call from my father this time, followed by a voicemail. I pressed play. His voice was clipped hard. You had no right to touch those accounts. You are embarrassing us. If you do not undo this, you will regret it. I deleted it without saving. The next day brought a knock at the door. Claire stood there, her hair pulled into a messy bun, concern etched across her face. She stepped inside without waiting for an invitation and looked around at the half-empty shelves. You are really doing this, she said. I nodded. I have to. She sat at the edge of the couch. I know what your family has put you through, but this is huge. Are you sure you are ready to walk away completely? I sat beside her, my voice calm. I have been ready for years. I just did not realize it until now. She reached over and squeezed my hand. Then I am proud of you. Her words steadied me in a way I had not expected. We talked for nearly an hour about work, about the things I might do next, about the places I could go. When she left, I felt less alone. That evening, I opened my laptop and typed out a resignation letter to the agency. It was brief, only a few lines citing personal reasons. I hit send before I could second-guess myself. 9 years ended in a single email. By the end of the week, my apartment was nearly empty. The bookshelf gone, the couch picked up by a young couple, the dining table loaded into a stranger's truck. What remained fit into the trunk of my car, clothes, my journal, the laptop, and the necklace box I could not bring myself to throw away. On Friday, I stood in the middle of the bare living room, the walls scuffed where furniture had been, the carpet flattened by years of use. I closed my eyes and listened to the silence. No footsteps, no phone calls, no voices demanding I be less. Just silence, clean and whole. The leasing office accepted my keys without fuss. By the time I walked back to my car, the sun had begun to dip, staining the sky with orange. I slid behind the wheel, started the engine, and rested my hands on the steering wheel. Brookfield lay behind me, shrinking in the rearview mirror as I pulled onto the highway. Ahead stretched miles of road, the kind that promised new beginnings if you had the courage to keep driving. I did not know exactly where I was headed yet, but I knew it would not be back. The first hour on the highway felt like breathing new air, each mile stretching a little farther from the weight of Brookfield. I passed towns I had only ever seen on exit signs, their water towers painted with mascots and slogans that made me smile despite myself. The radio played faintly in the background, but my thoughts drowned out the music. I kept hearing my father's voicemail, his voice sharp with control. For the first time, I did not feel fear. I felt something close to defiance. By the second day, I had stopped at a roadside motel just outside Lexington. The neon sign flickered, and the carpet smelled faintly of cigarettes, but it was a bed and a door that locked, and that was enough. I ate a sandwich from a gas station and lay awake staring at the ceiling fan. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, another string of missed calls. I turned it off completely. The silence was thick and I welcomed it. In the morning I checked the map again. My finger traced the line toward the coast toward South Carolina, where the ocean might wash some of this weight from me. I drove for hours, stopping only for gas and coffee, the suitcase rattling softly in the trunk. At a rest area, I caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror, hair pulled back, messily, eyes rimmed with exhaustion. But there was a steadiness in my face I had never seen before. Late that evening, I reached Seabrook, a town I had only chosen because the rental listing seemed quick and cheap. The streets were narrow-lined with old houses whose porches leaned under the weight of vines. The air smelled of salt and pine, and the sound of insects hummed through the night. I parked in front of the small cottage I had agreed to rent month to month. The porch sagged slightly, the paint peeling, but it felt like sanctuary. The landlord, a gray-haired man in a baseball cap, handed me the keys without fuss. He gave me a quick tour of the creaky floors, the kitchen with cabinets that stuck, the bedroom with a mattress that dipped in the middle. I signed the papers under the name Elaine Parker, my middle name scribbled where my first should have been. It was not a disguise so much as a beginning. When the door shut behind him, I stood alone in the empty cottage. The suitcase leaned against the wall, the journal tucked inside the necklace box, wedged between shirts. I set them down in the bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed. The silence here was different. Not heavy, not accusing, just quiet. The next morning I walked into town, the streets still waking with the smell of fresh bread from the bakery, and the sound of gulls circling above. I stopped at a cafe called Saltwater Brew, its chalkboard sign leaning slightly on the sidewalk. Inside, the air smelled of roasted beans and sugar. Behind the counter stood a woman in her late 40s with curly hair, pulled into a bun, her smile warm, as she handed me a menu. "First time here," she said. I nodded. "Just moved in." "Welcome to Seabrook," she said. "I am Maria. Coffee is on the house for newcomers." Her kindness caught me off guard. I accepted the mug and sat at a corner table, the steam rising in soft curls. For years I had been braced for criticism, for sharp eyes waiting for me to stumble. Now a stranger offered me welcome, without asking for anything in return. I felt my shoulders drop, my chest expand in a way that felt almost foreign. Over the next few days I settled into the rhythm of the town. I walked the marsh trails at dawn, the grass whispering under the wind. I unpacked my laptop and set up a profile on freelance sites offering marketing services, logo design, social media work. Small jobs trickled in, enough to cover groceries and rent. Each completed project felt like proof that I could build something on my own terms. At night, I sat on the porch with a notebook, listening to the frogs and the distant crash of waves. I wrote not about my family but about myself, about the dreams I had buried, the life I wanted to build. The words came halting at first, then freely, as if they had been waiting for years to be spoken. One evening, Maria slid into the seat across from me at the cafe, her apron dusted with flour. She asked how I was liking Seabrook. I told her it felt like breathing again. She nodded knowingly, as if she had heard it before. "This town is good for starting over," she said. "Lots of us came here for that." Her words settled into me like a promise. For the first time in years, I believed I might not just be surviving. I might be beginning. That night, as I walked back to the cottage, the moon hung low over the marsh, its reflection rippling on the water. I carried a bag of groceries in one hand, my keys in the other, and for once the weight I felt was not burden but possibility. Inside, I placed the groceries on the counter and opened the window to let the salt air in. The suitcase still sat half unpacked in the corner, but I did not rush to finish. Some part of me liked the reminder that I was still moving forward, still shaping what came next. I made a cup of tea and stood on the porch listening to the night sounds of Seabrook. My phone, long silent, lay inside on the table. For the first time, I felt no urge to pick it up. No pull to see what accusations or demands waited. I let it sit untouched, as irrelevant to my present as the house in Brookfield was to my future. The marsh stretched out in the distance, wide and unbroken. I sipped the tea slowly, feeling the warmth spread through me, and knew I had stepped into a life that was finally my own. The peace of Seabrook lasted less than 3 weeks before the past clawed its way back. One morning I turned on my old phone, the one I kept buried in the drawer, just to check in on the world I had left. Dozens of missed calls and messages flooded the screen, most of them from my mother. My chest tightened as I scrolled through. The most recent was a public post forwarded from a community Facebook page in Brookfield. There was her picture, my mother Eleanor, standing in front of the church with her hand pressed dramatically to her chest. The caption read that her youngest daughter had abandoned the family during a time of need and stolen money from accounts meant for medical bills. The words cut deeper than I expected, even though I knew the truth. My father had commented beneath it, saying they had given me everything and I had betrayed them. People I barely knew chimed in, some offering sympathy, others whispering judgment. I set the phone down on the counter and gripped the edge until my knuckles whitened. My first instinct was to call to defend myself, to explain, but I stopped. For once, I had proof on my side. That afternoon, I drove back into Columbus to meet Mark Henderson again. His office smelled of strong coffee and paper, the air-conditioned hum steady. I slid the phone across his desk, the post open on the screen. He read it slowly, his brow tightening. "This is defamation," he said plainly, "but we do not even need to go that far. The trust records are clear. Every dollar is accounted for. Your contributions were documented. If they push this story in public, we have evidence to counter." I asked what I should do. He leaned back in his chair, folding his hands. "Let them dig their own hole. If you respond directly, you feed their narrative. If you stay quiet, the truth will eventually surface when they cannot back up their claims." His calm steadied me, but it did not erase the sting of betrayal. Back in Seabrook, I returned to Saltwater Brew. Maria noticed the tension in my shoulders the moment I stepped in. "Family trouble again?" she asked gently. I gave a weary smile and nodded. "They are saying I stole from them." She poured me coffee and leaned on the counter. "You would be surprised how often I hear that. Families twist stories when they lose control. The best revenge is living a life that proves them wrong." Her words echoed in my head long after I left the cafe. 2 days later, another message appeared, this time from my mother's doctor. A careful email that respected privacy but assured me her condition was stable. It confirmed what I had suspected. She had tried to pull $10,000 from the account for an emergency, but there had been no true emergency at all. The following morning, news spread further. A local Brookfield paper ran a short piece repeating my mother's claims. They quoted her directly, painting her as a woman betrayed by her own daughter. My father was listed as confirming the story. My sister Rachel stayed silent, as if silence might shield her. I forwarded the article to Mark. He replied within an hour, with an official statement drafted in simple terms, outlining the purpose of the trust and the documentation of every expense. Reading it over, I felt vindicated but also weary. My family had always twisted the narrative, but now they were doing it publicly and strangers believed them. That night I walked the marsh trail until the sun dipped low, the air thick with the smell of salt. Guilt whispered in the corners of my mind, the old voice that told me I was wrong for leaving, wrong for protecting myself. But I pressed on, reminding myself that their lies did not make me the villain. Back at the cottage, I brewed tea and sat on the porch. My phone buzzed again, this time a private message from Rachel. "I miss you," she wrote. "We can fix this. Please call." I stared at the words, my throat tight. For years I had begged for her to stand up for me, to speak when our parents cut me down. She never had. Now, when the weight of the lies was too heavy for her to ignore, she reached out with the faint promise of repair. I closed the message without replying. The next day at the grocery store, Maria waved me over to her cart. She held up a newspaper someone had left behind. The Brookfield article had made its way farther than I expected. "People here are talking," she said. "If you want the truth to come out, you should let your lawyer release that statement." Her concern was genuine, her voice steady. I promised her I would think about it. That evening I checked the trust portal online. Requests for $3,000 for home repairs and $5,000 for supposed medical bills had been denied for lack of proof. Yet the account had paid utilities and prescriptions exactly as it was meant to. The evidence was there in black and white. My parents' narrative was crumbling, but they kept doubling down. I drafted a short email to Dr. Evans, the physician who had contacted me. "Thank you for your honesty," I wrote. "Please continue to provide care as needed. The trust covers all legitimate expenses. I appreciate your clarity." It felt good to write it clear and factual with no apology woven between the lines. That night, as the crickets sang outside my window, I sat with the weight of it all. My family had declared me a thief, a traitor, an embarrassment. Yet for the first time in my life, I held the power to prove them wrong. The truth sat with me steady and unshaken. The cottage was quiet, the marsh stretching into the darkness. I closed my eyes and let the stillness sink into me. Tomorrow would bring another battle, but tonight I let myself rest in the knowledge that I was no longer the one being erased. The following morning sunlight poured through the blinds, and I woke with the odd feeling that something was shifting even from miles away. My phone blinked with a message from a number I recognized, but had not saved Daniel Carter. I hesitated before opening it. He wrote that things at home were falling apart, that Rachel was not the woman he thought she was, and that my parents were making everything worse. The words were clipped almost desperate, as if he did not know who else to reach out to. I read it 3 times before setting the phone aside. For years I had seen the cracks in Rachel's perfect image, the way she absorbed our parents' praise without ever noticing who paid the price. Now her husband was discovering the truth. It was not satisfaction I felt, but a kind of grim recognition. Later that day, I sat at my small desk in the cottage, working through a freelance project, when another message appeared. This time, it was from Rachel herself. She asked if I would talk, said she needed me. I stared at the screen, remembering all the nights I had begged for her voice to break through the silence, the way she had stood by as our parents cut me down again and again. Now, when her own foundation was crumbling, she suddenly found her voice. I did not reply. Instead, I went for a walk along the marsh. The air was heavy with the scent of salt and mud, the calls of herons carrying across the water. Each step settled me, reminding me that distance was not just physical but emotional. I had stepped away, and I did not have to step back. That evening, Maria found me at the cafe, notebook open in front of me. She set down a slice of peach pie and slid into the chair across from me. "Trouble still following you?" she asked softly. I nodded, pushing the phone across the table. She skimmed the messages, her brow furrowing. "Looks like the cracks are showing." I let out a hollow laugh. They built their house on appearances. It was only a matter of time before it collapsed. Maria studied me for a long moment. "You do not owe them rescue, Lauren. Remember that." Her words sank deep, anchoring me in place. The next few days brought more ripples. A former coworker from Columbus, someone I had not spoken to in months, reached out with a text. She said she had run into Rachel and Daniel at a dinner in Chicago. Daniel had left halfway through, his jaw tight, while Rachel stayed behind, trying to laugh as if nothing was wrong. People were talking, she wrote. News traveled fast. My parents cared more about their reputation than truth, and now it was their golden daughter who looked fragile in front of others. I sat with the irony of it one night, the necklace box open on my lap. The sapphire gleamed in the lamplight, meant as a gift for a sister who had never truly seen me. Now it felt like a relic of a version of myself I had already buried. I closed the lid and set it aside, a quiet farewell. The phone buzzed again, another message from Daniel. He wrote that Rachel had accused him of not supporting her family, that my parents were pushing into their finances, questioning his every decision. He ended with one line that stayed with me. "I do not know how you lived with them as long as you did." I wanted to answer, to tell him I had not lived, I had endured. But I left the screen dark. Some truths were not mine to give anymore. One morning, walking through town, I passed a small bookstore tucked between a bakery and a thrift shop. A sign in the window read, "Help Wanted." I stepped inside on impulse. The air smelled of paper and coffee, the shelves packed tight with novels and travel guides. An older woman behind the counter looked up with a smile. "You new around here?" she asked. I nodded. "Just a few weeks." She handed me an application form. "We could use someone a few mornings a week. Nothing fancy but honest work." I filled it out on the spot, my handwriting steady. When I handed it back, she said she would call me by the weekend. Walking out into the sunlight, I felt something shift again. I was not just escaping, I was building. That night, I sat on the porch with my tea, the marsh stretching into darkness. My phone lay on the table beside me, buzzing again with Rachel's name. I watched it glow, then fade. Each unanswered call felt like another wall rising between us, not built from anger, but from choice. I sipped slowly, the warmth steady in my hands. Somewhere in Chicago, my sister's perfect life was unraveling, and my parents' control was slipping. For the first time, I did not feel like the shadow in their story. I felt like the author of my own. The bookstore called on Friday morning while I was folding laundry in the cottage. The owner, Mrs. Whitaker, said she liked my application and asked if I could start the following week. Her voice was warm, the kind that carried trust without effort. I agreed instantly. Hanging up, I realized how long it had been since someone saw me as capable without strings attached. I spent the rest of the day preparing, ironing a plain blouse, polishing my shoes, even though the job was only a few hours a week. It felt important, like planting a stake into this new soil. That night, I wrote in my journal about how different this chapter of my life already felt. Instead of duty, there was choice. Instead of sacrifice, there was growth. On Monday, I walked to the bookstore, just as the sun rose, casting gold light on the windows. Inside, the air smelled of coffee and old pages. Mrs. Whitaker showed me how to organize shipments, ring up customers, and restock shelves. By noon, I was helping a teenager find a novel for a school project. She thanked me with genuine enthusiasm, and I smiled in a way I had not in years. Days passed quickly. I fell into a rhythm of mornings at the bookstore, afternoons working on freelance projects, evenings spent walking the marsh trails or sipping tea on the porch. The simplicity of it healed me in ways I had not expected. For once, no one demanded more than I could give. But the peace did not last long. One afternoon, Maria slid a folded newspaper across the cafe table where I sat with my laptop. She tapped the headline. My parents had given another interview, this time to a regional outlet. The words were bold. Daughter drains family accounts, leaves them struggling. My chest tightened as I scanned the article. My father's quotes painted me as reckless and selfish, my mother's words dripping with practiced sorrow. Rachel's name appeared only once mentioned, as the sister forced to carry the burden I had abandoned. I looked up at Maria, my throat dry. They will never stop. She shook her head. That is because you finally drew a line. They do not know how to live without someone crossing it for them. That night I called Mark. He answered on the second ring, his tone calm as always. I told him about the article, my voice tight with anger. He reassured me that the trust records remained solid. He even suggested releasing a summary, publicly, a clear timeline, showing my contributions and the way expenses were covered. He reminded me that truth had weight, and eventually weight tipped the scales. I thanked him, though my hands still trembled when I hung up. 2 days later, something unexpected happened. At the bookstore, a woman lingered at the counter long after buying a mystery novel. She studied me with curious eyes. "You are Lauren Miller, right?" she asked. My stomach dropped. I nodded slowly, bracing for judgment. Instead, her expression softened. "I am sorry for what your family is saying. My cousin lives in Brookfield." She told me enough to know the story is not what it looks like. The kindness in her voice cracked something inside me. I thanked her quietly, and after she left, I leaned against the counter, fighting the tears pressing at my eyes. Someone believed me without proof. The shift continued. Emails from clients praised my work, calling me reliable and creative. Mrs. Whitaker told me she was glad to have me at the store. Maria invited me to join a book club at the cafe, where women gathered every Thursday night with wine and novels. Each moment stitched a new thread into the life I was building, but shadows lingered. My phone buzzed late one evening with a voicemail from Rachel. Her voice was shaky, almost breaking. She admitted Daniel had moved out, that he could not take my parents' meddling any longer. She said she missed me, that she wished things had been different. Then her voice hardened, layered with something sharper. "If you had not frozen those accounts, maybe none of this would have happened." I set the phone down, my heart pounding. The old guilt tried to creep in, whispering that it was my fault, that I had pulled the thread that unraveled everything. But I forced myself to breathe, to remember. The accounts had been mine to protect. The lies had been theirs to tell. The next morning I walked along the marsh, the tide low, the mudflats exposed. Herons stood motionless in the shallow water. I stopped and let the wind press against me, cool and steady. It was not my job to carry Rachel's marriage or my parents' reputation. For too long I had carried their burdens, bent under the weight, until I could not see my own reflection. Now I stood straighter. When I returned to the cottage, I sat at the desk and opened my journal. I wrote Rachel's words on the page. Maybe none of this would have happened. Then I crossed them out with one long line. Beneath it I wrote what felt truer. This would have happened anyway. As the sun set, painting the marsh in orange light, I closed the journal and placed it on the shelf. The cottage was quiet, the air filled with the smell of tea steeping in the kitchen. For the first time in weeks, my heartbeat slowed, steady and calm. I had weathered their accusations, faced their attempts to drag me back, and still I remained standing. Outside, the first stars blinked to life above Seabrook. I sat on the porch watching the horizon fade into darkness and felt something close to peace settling into my bones. The morning after was clear and bright, the kind of day when the sky seemed to stretch forever. I brewed coffee and sat at the small kitchen table, the hum of the kettle fading into silence. My phone buzzed again, this time with an email forwarded by Mark. It was a final notice from the bank, confirming that my parents had been denied yet another attempt to withdraw a large sum. The numbers stared back at me, proof that their reach had ended. I felt a weight lift. For years they had dictated my choices through money, guilt, and expectation. Now the account stood as a barrier, firm and unbreakable. I closed the laptop and let myself breathe deeply, filling my chest with air that belonged to no one but me. Later that afternoon, I walked to the bookstore for my shift. Mrs. Whitaker handed me a stack of returns and smiled. Customers had started asking for me by name, she said, because I recommended books they actually enjoyed. Her words warmed me in a way my parents' praise never had. Recognition given without strings attached felt like sunlight after a long winter. The weeks slipped by quietly. My routine became steady, grounding me. Work at the store, freelance projects at the cottage, evenings spent at the cafe's book club, with women who laughed loudly and welcomed me as if I had always belonged. Seabrook slowly wrapped me in its rhythm, a place where no one knew me as the daughter who failed, but simply as Lauren, the woman who lived in the cottage by the marsh. Then, one evening while I was closing the store, my phone buzzed again. This time it was not my parents or Rachel. It was a message from Daniel. He wrote that the marriage was over, that Rachel had moved back in with my parents, and that he finally understood the suffocating grip they carried. He thanked me oddly for showing him what standing up looked like. I read his words slowly, unsure how to feel. Pity for Rachel flickered, but it was quickly replaced by a calm acceptance. She had chosen their approval for so long. Now she lived with the consequences. I locked the store and stepped out into the cool night air. The street was quiet, the windows glowing with warm, light, laughter spilling from the diner across the road. I realized then that I no longer needed to measure myself against Rachel, against anyone in Brookfield. Their world continued to spin, but it no longer defined me. Back at the cottage, I opened the velvet box one last time. The sapphire caught the lamplight, as brilliant as the day I bought it. For a moment I imagined slipping it into Rachel's hands, imagined her thanking me. That vision dissolved, replaced with the reality of who she had always been. I closed the box and carried it outside. At the edge of the marsh, the water rippled under the moonlight. I held the box in my hand, felt the weight of all it symbolized, then opened it and let the necklace slide into the water. The sapphire disappeared beneath the surface with barely a splash. I stood there until the ripples faded, the air cool against my face. It felt like a final line drawn, the last tether cut. When I returned inside, the cottage felt lighter, the air clearer. I poured a cup of tea and sat on the porch watching the horizon. The stars shimmered above, endless and steady. For the first time in my life, I felt free not only from my parents' grip, but from the need to prove myself to anyone at all. I thought of the girl I used to be, the one who stood in kitchens with drawings, ignored the one who gave up job interviews, the one who folded herself smaller each year. She no longer lived here. In her place was a woman who chose silence when it was healthy, distance when it was necessary, and freedom when it was possible. Life in Seabrook continued to unfold. Work, friends, small joys like fresh bread from the bakery or the feel of salt air on my skin. These moments, simple and real, were mine alone. Looking back, I realized my parents had been right about one thing. They had told me to stay invisible. I had obeyed, but not in the way they imagined. I vanished from their world and built my own. If you have ever carried the weight of being unseen, if you have ever walked away from a family that refused to value you, know this. Choosing yourself is not cruelty. It is survival. And sometimes it is the beginning of everything you have been waiting for. Thank you for listening to my story. If it spoke to you, share your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe for more stories like this. And let's keep reminding each other that even the hardest goodbyes can lead to the life we deserve.